English 101 online with Josh. The time to learn is now.
I just wanted to put out a quick video to chat with you a little bit about the revision process, which is the process that all of you are engaged in as you kind of take the feedback from your peer review and apply it to the drafts that you're going to be turning in to me. So I just want to give a couple of words to kind of help frame this process, and then also give you some concrete strategies for how to actually implement some serious changes to your paper. Which is really the point of what we're doing, because I really want to emphasize the difference between revision and proofreading, because this is a distinction that a lot of students aren't really aware of. Proofreading is simply going in, adding commas, fixing spelling, maybe fixing a sentence structure or two. It's very surface level changes, and it's usually the very last step in the process. This is different from revision. Revision is the process of revisioning or re-seeing your paper. Basically, it's the process of taking a rough draft and being willing to completely transform it, reimagine it into something new and much more interesting and exciting to read. And so when you're thinking about revision, I think the important thing to start with is that anytime you're writing a rough draft, it's usually just an okay rough draft. And that's exactly what you want. You want to just get something on the paper, rough clay. But once you have that rough clay, it's your job to really shape it, into an interesting paper, and one that achieves your purpose in writing. This takes time and effort, and more than anything else, it takes a willingness to take your work apart, judge it fairly, and put it back together again in a new way. Solve a coagula. This is what we talked about in our very first video about analysis, and it's a similar process with revision. It's your job now to take apart the writing that you've done, analyze it to see, okay, what is working, what isn't working, and then put it back together in a new way so that those issues are resolved. I like to think of revision as a form of magic. You're transforming something into something new. And so we're going to focus a little bit on what that process might look like for you. By the way, hope everyone's doing well today. I'm out here at the baseball field by my house trying to get a change of scenery. So, if you hear cars driving by, sorry about that. All right, so step one. And this is a step that students often skip over. And it seems like a really simple step, but it's an incredibly important step in the process. And this is simply rereading your paper. Because you have fresh eyes now. You've spent a little bit of time away from your paper. And now when you go back to read it, you're going to notice things and see things that you might have missed the first time that you wrote it. I really recommend reading it out loud or having a friend read it out loud to you, because this is going to allow your ears to pick up on things that your eyes might miss. Oftentimes we'll skip over things or fill in the blanks for ourselves, but really hearing it out loud will point out those areas that need some attention. So your first step is diagnosis. And this just means taking a little bit of time to figure out what's working and what isn't working. And I really emphasize this with students. Of course, it's your job to find the weaknesses in your paper. But it's also your job to figure out what are the parts of your paper that are working really well, and how can you kind of replicate that throughout the rest of the paper. Of course, recognizing, what's working and what doesn't takes practice, but there's no way to do it without just jumping right in. And so, one way to do it is to think about symptoms and causes. Symptoms would be things like, oh, this doesn't quite make sense, or, ooh, I feel like, a reader would get kind of lost here. They're the effects. Causes are the root underlying reasons for those effects. And so that might be things like a lack of a strong organization, a lack of strong topic sentences. It might mean that you haven't analyzed your evidence clearly enough. And so taking the time to really figure out what's working and what isn't is your first step. All right, so that's step one. Step two is triage, because you can't possibly make all of the changes that need to be made in one go, and you have a limited set of time. And not only that, there are some changes that should be prioritized and should come first, and there are other changes that really should be saved for the later stages of revision. We talk about these in terms of higher order concerns and lower order concerns. Higher order concerns are those aspects of writing that if you miss it, it doesn't matter how polished your paper is, it's not going anywhere. These are things like argumentation. And by argumentation, I mean, are you reaching your purpose? Do you know what your purpose is for writing, and have you achieved that purpose? How well have you utilized evidence? Is there evidence that you're leaving out? Or have you found the best quotes to really emphasize your points? Argumentation is also how strongly you analyze that evidence, and how that analysis ultimately ties back to your thesis statement. Thesis statements are another important aspect of argumentation. And if you don't have a strong thesis guiding your paper, that's probably going to be the first thing that you really want to revise, because everything else is going to fall underneath that. So that's argumentation. The other big higher order concern is organization. And this is things like, do you have an introduction and a conclusion that really help frame... Hey, how you doing, sir? Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Have a great day. All right, just chatting with the neighbors. Where was I? Organization, right? Introductions and conclusions. Do you have a framework for your paper? Do you have an introduction that sets up the expectations for your reader? And do you have a conclusion which ties those expectations together and kind of leaves them with an easy and synthesized takeaway? Is the order of your ideas the best order to present your argument? And do you have things like topic sentences and transitions to help frame those main points so that the connections between them are really relevant and clear for your reader? So that's kind of how I look at higher order concerns. Is your argument good, and is it well organized? But then you have lower order concerns, which just because they're called lower order concerns doesn't mean they don't matter. They do still matter, but you shouldn't really attempt to really work on these until you've gotten the higher order concerns where you want them. And lower order concerns really come down to the language that you use. Have you really elevated your diction to best express your ideas? Is your sentence structure, clear, and does it leave a reader kind of interested in hanging on to what you're saying? And then, of course, there's all the things like grammar and, the basic nitty-gritty mechanics, which are important because they lend you authority. So that's triage. Just figuring out what is the best order to work through the changes that you need to make in your draft. I highly recommend argumentation first, get that in line, then work on your organization, and then work on those nitty-gritty details. Because after all, there's no sense in polishing up a paragraph that you might realize doesn't really help your argument and needs to be removed. So that's triage. And then the next step is just implementing those changes and setting concrete goals for yourself to, make the best use of the time that you have. Because writing is never done, it's just abandoned. So you have to just simply try to do as many strong changes as you can until you kind of hit that deadline. And of course, you have the benefit in this class of being able to revise multiple times to really, really hit that level of writing that's going to really surprise you just how strong of a writer you can really be. So, some strategies that I think really work and that are useful just about in any circumstance. I think the biggest one is the reverse outline. And this is really simply going through your paper and paragraph by paragraph, extracting what the main idea of that paragraph is and writing it in the margin. This does a number of things. It will help clarify your organization for you and help you understand how your ideas fit together. It can also help clarify what ideas aren't actually connecting to your thesis and to your purpose, and you then can decide whether or not you want to keep those ideas but transform them to make them connect, or just abandon them and replace them with something stronger. Reverse outlines can also help you find places where there are gaps in your logic, where you make a jump that you really need to be walking your reader through a little bit more clearly. So that's reverse outline. Highly recommend that strategy. It's great for strengthening your arguments, but it's also great for really understanding your organization and your paper. Once you have those main ideas extracted, it's a lot easier to manipulate those than it is to try to just completely rip your paper apart. All right, another strategy that I've already talked about, but that I want to double down on is reading your paper aloud and having a friend read it out loud to you. And what I would recommend is have a friend read your paper to you and take notes as they're going along. Listen to their voice. Are there areas where they seem confused? Because if they're confused reading your paper, you can bet that a lot of audience members might feel the same. And so honing in on those areas of the reader's confusion can help you kind of figure out where the weak spots of your paper are. One thing that you can do if you feel like you just want to kind of throw a curveball in there is spice up your paper by adding new evidence or new lines of argument and see where that takes you. A lot of times students are hesitant to do this, but kind of shifting your argument a bit, adding new ways of thinking about it can really, really take a paper and elevate it. Because think about it, you've had time to really process this argument and find new ways of thinking about it. So the changes in your thinking should be reflected in your paper. Another strategy that I like to use and that I think can really strengthen a paper is to go through and highlight any words, phrases, or ideas that need further clarification or definition. A lot of times, when you're writing, something makes sense in your head, but you can't quite count on your audience sharing your understanding. And so going through and clearly defining your terms, clearly clarifying your wording so that your reader's sharing your understanding, these are ways to elevate a paper and actually add a bit of length if you're struggling with length as well. And of course, the last concrete strategy that I'm really going to throw out there for you is to visit the peer writing lab. Because having a dedicated writing tutor talk through your ideas and help give you clarity on the revision that you need to do is going to save you a lot of time and a lot of headache. Writing is a collaborative process, especially when you get to the revision stage, because sometimes you need an outside voice to show you what you can't see about your own paper. I recognize this video was all over the place. A random neighbor started talking to me in the middle of it. I lost my train of thought like 3 times. But what I want to kind of end on is this. The work that you've done so far on this paper is really good. But you would be doing yourself a disservice if you got too attached to it. Of course you love it. You poured hours of labor into it. But it's your job now to be willing to completely transform it, to take new risks, and to say, hey, maybe this thing that I wrote that at the time felt really great ultimately doesn't fit my purpose. It's a tough process, but it's really rewarding. Now, whenever you're slashing and burning, Don't actually delete any of the stuff. Put it into a separate Word document because you never know when you might need it later. But that willingness to completely reimagine your paper is what separates, beginning writers from experienced writers. Knowing that you don't have to be attached to anything that you write, and everything should be in service to your purpose. All right, well, that's all I got for you all today. Thanks for bearing with this video, and I'll see you all on Friday.